Everyone said my grandfather was a violent lunatic best left rotting in that hillside mansion. They claimed isolation was for our protection. Yet when I broke the rules to bring him water the night he collapsed, I did not find madness in his eyes. I found clarity. My parents forbade me from saving his life, not because they loved me, but because my entire existence was a lie designed to cash a check worth millions. My name is Rowan Hayes. At 32 years old, I made my living finding hidden truths in corporate ledgers as a senior auditor in Seattle, yet I remained willfully blind to the falsehoods that governed my own life. I lived in a perpetual state of emotional debt to my parents, Greg and Linda. They had sacrificed everything for me, or so they reminded me during every Sunday dinner. I was the fragile bird they had nursed back to health, the sickly child who needed constant protection from a world that was too harsh for her delicate constitution. Even as an adult, the narrative persisted. If I sneezed, Linda was there with a bottle of unauthorized supplements and a lecture about my weak immune system. "You know your body isn't like other people's. Rowan," she would say, her voice dripping with a cloying concern that felt like syrup pouring over a trap. "We just want you safe. That is all we have ever wanted." I believed them. I let their anxiety become my cage, terrified that stepping outside their boundaries would lead to my inevitable collapse. Mark, my husband, was the only one who saw the bars I could not. He was a pragmatic lawyer who dealt in facts, not guilt trips. He often watched Greg and Linda with a narrowed gaze, especially when they insisted I was too tired to go out or too frail to travel. "They treat you like a porcelain doll that is already cracked," Mark told me once after a particularly suffocating visit. "It is not normal. Rowan, you are healthy. You run miles every morning. Why do you let them convince you that you are dying?" Then there was the matter of my grandfather, Silas Thorne. He was the mysterious patriarch of Thorne Industries, a man rumored to be a violent, dementia-ridden monster who lived in the crumbling family estate on the hill. My parents claimed he was dangerous. They said his isolation was for everyone's safety. So, he sat up there, guarded by private nurses my father hired, fading into obscurity while Greg managed his affairs. The crack in the facade appeared on a rainy Tuesday. I received a crumpled envelope at my office with no return address. Inside was a scrawled note from a man claiming to be a former gardener at the Thorne estate. It read that Mr. Silas was suffering from acute kidney failure and was being denied medication. The writer claimed they were only giving him water and pills to make him sleep. My auditor's brain demanded verification. I drove straight to my parents' house through the downpour. I sat in their pristine living room and showed them the note, expecting them to call an ambulance immediately. Instead, Linda turned pale, and Greg's face twisted into a snarl I barely recognized. "This is garbage!" Greg spat, crumpling the note in his fist. "Some disgruntled employee is trying to stir up trouble. Dad is fine. He is comfortable?" "Comfortable?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly as I looked at the paper in his hand. The note says, "Kidney failure. Dad. We need to get him to a specialist. I can pay for it if the trust will not cover it." "No," Linda shrieked. The volume of her voice made me flinch. She composed herself quickly, smoothing her skirt, but her eyes were wild. "Rowan, honey, you do not understand. He is in pain. He is old. Sometimes letting nature take its course is the greatest mercy." Mercy. I looked from one to the other, a cold feeling settling in my stomach. Denying medical care is not mercy. It is neglect. "I am going up there to check on him." Greg stepped forward, blocking my path to the door. His posture was threatening, his hands clenched into fists. "You will do no such thing," he growled. "He is violent. Rowan, do you want to be attacked? Do you want to end up in the hospital with your weak heart? You stay away from that house. That is an order." I left, but the seed of doubt had taken root. Their reaction had not been grief or protective caution. It was panic. They were not afraid for me. They were afraid of what I might see. Back home, I paced the kitchen floor, relaying the scene to Mark. He sat at the island, listening intently. "They blocked you physically?" Mark asked, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "Yes," I replied, feeling the memory of Greg's looming figure. He looked like he wanted to hit me. Mark stood up and took my hands. "Rowan, listen to me. A gardener does not write a note like that for fun. And parents do not ban their adult daughter from seeing her dying grandfather unless they are hiding something massive." "But the rule," I whispered, looking at the rain lashing against the window. 2 decades of no contact. "Screw the rule," Mark said firmly. "If he dies and it turns out this note was true, could you live with that?" I looked at him, the fear of my parents finally eclipsed by a greater duty. "No," I said. "No." I could not. "Then we go tonight." Mark decided. "They think you are too scared to disobey. Let us prove them wrong." The rain that lashed against the windshield of my car was torrential, a perfect cover for the crime I was about to commit. I parked a quarter of a mile down the hill and approached Thorne Manor on foot. The iron gates were rusted shut, but the service entrance code Mark had dug up from old contractor records still worked. I slipped inside, shivering not from the cold, but from the oppressive atmosphere of the house. It did not feel like the residence of a billionaire industrialist. It felt like a mausoleum. The air was stagnant, heavy with the chemical sting of cheap pine disinfectant and the underlying sweet rot of neglect. I navigated the dark hallways by the light of my phone, my footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet. When I pushed open the door to the master suite, my breath caught in my throat. My grandfather, Silas Thorne, lay on a bed that looked too large for his shrunken frame. He was skeletal, his skin the color of old parchment, his breathing shallow and rattling. I approached the bed, terrified that I was already too late. "Grandpa," I whispered, reaching out to touch his hand. It was ice cold. His eyelids fluttered, and for a moment the haze cleared. He looked at me, and I saw recognition spark in those gray depths. "Rowan." His voice was a dry rasp, barely audible over the storm outside. Is that really you? "It is me," I said, tears stinging my eyes. "I am here to help." He gripped my wrist with surprising strength, his fingers digging into my skin. Don't trust them," he wheezed, his eyes darting to the door in panic. Check the trust fund. They are waiting for me to die." I looked at the bedside table. There were no dialysis bags, no kidney medication. Instead, I saw rows of orange pill bottles. I picked one up and shone my light on the label. Haloperidol, lorazepam. These were heavy sedatives and antipsychotics, enough to keep a horse unconscious, let alone a failing old man. They were not treating his kidneys, they were chemically restraining him. I knew I had very little time. I pulled a pair of scissors from my pocket and snipped a small lock of hair from the back of his head, stuffing it into a plastic bag. I then grabbed the clipboard hanging at the foot of the bed and snapped rapid photos of the falsified medical charts. Just as I finished, a red LED light on the ceiling smoke detector blinked solid crimson. It was a motion-activated camera. Greg was watching. I fled into the night, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The confrontation happened an hour later in my own living room. Greg and Linda stormed in, not with concern, but with a fury that bordered on mania. "You ungrateful, stupid girl!" Greg screamed, his face turning a shade of purple I had never seen before. "We explicitly forbade you from going there. Do you have any idea what you have done? I saw a dying man who is being drugged." I shot back, my hands trembling as I held my ground. "He is not crazy. Dad, he is being murdered." Linda burst into theatric tears, collapsing onto my sofa. "Oh, Greg." She does not know, she wailed, looking up at me with tear-filled eyes. "Rowan, honey, we didn't want to tell you. We wanted to protect you from the truth. Silas. He tried to kill you. I froze. What? When you were 3, Greg said, his voice dropping to a sinister whisper. He had an episode. He held you under the water in the bathtub. He laughed while you drowned. We saved you just in time. That is why we keep you away. He is a monster. Rowan. I looked at them. The story was horrific, designed to shatter my resolve. But as I looked at Greg's shifting eyes and Linda's practiced sobbing, a cold realization settled over me. I did not remember the event, but I remembered the fear in Silas's eyes tonight. It was not the eyes of a killer. It was the eyes of a victim. You are lying, I said quietly. If you go back there, Greg hissed, stepping into my personal space, we will cut you off. No family, no support. You will be dead to us. Then I guess I am an orphan. I replied. The next morning, I initiated my plan. I needed to donate a kidney to save Silas, but I needed a medical clearance first. I went to Dr. Evans, the family physician who had treated me since childhood and who played golf with Greg every Sunday. I sat on the paper-covered exam table, explaining my intent. Dr. Evans didn't even pick up his stethoscope. He just shook his head, a patronizing smile plastered on his face. Rowan, be reasonable, he said, closing his folder without looking at my chart. With your history, your heart murmur, your fragile immune system, no ethics board would approve you as a donor. You would not survive the anesthesia. I ran a marathon last year. Dr. Evans, I said, fighting the urge to scream. My heart is fine. You were lucky, he said dismissively. I cannot sign off on this. It is suicide. Go home and let your parents handle your grandfather. They know what is best. He was stonewalling me. The wall was higher than I thought, but he had just made a mistake. By refusing to test me, he confirmed that my health was not the issue. The issue was what a blood test might reveal. Mark pulled every legal string he had to get the emergency court order. By leveraging a favor from a judge he had clerked for, we bypassed Dr. Evans and had grandfather Silas transferred to St. Jude's Private Hospital, a facility completely outside my father's sphere of influence. Greg and Linda threatened to sue the hospital, screaming over the phone that I was mentally unstable and coercing a senile old man. But Mark filed a temporary injunction that kept them outside the security perimeter. For the first time in 20 years, Silas was safe. The initial medical report from the independent toxicologist landed on the desk of Dr. Eris like a judge's gavel. It was not diabetes or natural age-related decline that was killing my grandfather. We found high concentrations of heavy metals in his blood, Dr. Eris told us, pointing to the spikes on the chart. Arsenic and mercury. These levels suggest accumulation over a long period, perhaps 5 or 6 years. It mimics renal failure perfectly if you aren't looking for it. My blood ran cold. The cheap food, the strange medicine bottles, the isolation, it was a slow-motion execution. He needs a transplant. Dr. Eris continued, looking grim. Dialysis is keeping him stable, but his kidneys are necrotic, without a new organ. He has maybe 3 weeks. Take mine, I said immediately. I want to be tested. Mark squeezed my hand, but he didn't object. He knew there was no stopping me. The hospital expedited the process, drawing vials of my blood for HLA typing and a full DNA profile to ensure the best possible match. While we waited for the biological data to process, I turned my attention to the paper trail. If they were killing him, there had to be a financial deadline. I set up a workstation in the hospital waiting room and hacked into the public records of Thorne Industries. As a senior auditor, I knew exactly how to look for rot in a company's foundation. It didn't take long to find it. Greg had been bleeding the company dry. Under the guise of guardianship management fees, he was siphoning off roughly $200,000 a month. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. I traced a series of massive wire transfers, some totaling over $1 million sent to a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. Nouveau départ, I whispered, reading the name of the shell company on the screen. New start. They were funding their retirement with his blood. It gets worse, Mark said, dropping a stack of legal documents on the small table between us. I looked into the property records. Greg filed a motion to liquidate the Thorne estate 48 hours ago. He is trying to bypass the trust's restrictions on selling assets. He claimed Silas was incapacitated beyond recovery. He knew, I said, feeling a surge of nausea. He knew Silas was dying because he was the one killing him. The puzzle pieces were locking together into a horrifying picture of greed. But the final piece came from Dr. Eris later that evening. He called us into his office, his expression unreadable. He held 2 sheets of paper. We have the results of the compatibility tests. Dr. Eris said, sitting down, "The good news is that you are a perfect match for Silas. In fact, the HLA markers are identical on 6 out of 6 points. It is the kind of match we usually only see in siblings or extremely close direct lineage." "That is great," I said, relieved. "So, we can proceed. We can—" Dr. Eris hesitated, looking at the papers again. "But there is an anomaly in the background check. To verify genetic history for potential hereditary diseases, we cross-referenced your DNA against the samples on file for your parents, which were submitted when you were admitted for your tonsillectomy years ago." He slid the paper across the desk. "Rowan, you share 25% of your DNA with Silas, confirming he is your grandfather. But you share 0% with Greg Hayes and Linda Hayes." I stared at the numbers, the world tilting on its axis. That is impossible," I stammered. "They are my parents. I have their last name. I grew up in their house." "Genetically speaking," Dr. Eris said softly, "you are total strangers to them." I looked at Mark, and I saw the same dawning horror in his eyes that I felt in my heart. If I wasn't their daughter, then who was I, and why had they spent 30 years keeping me weak, terrified, and separated from the only person I was actually related to? The reason they forbade me from saving Silas wasn't just to hide the poison. It was to hide the fact that I belonged to him, not them. I sat frozen in the sterile chair of Dr. Eris's office, the hum of the air conditioner sounding like a roar in my ears. The paper in my hand felt heavy, as if the ink itself carried the weight of 1,000 lies. 0%, I whispered, my voice breaking. "You are telling me that the people who raised me, the people who told me every day that I was too weak to survive without them, are strangers biologically?" "Yes," Dr. Eris said gently, his expression filled with pity. "There is no genetic relationship whatsoever." "Rowan, you are Silas Thorne's granddaughter, but you are not Greg and Linda Hayes's daughter." My mind raced backward, tearing through 32 years of memories. Suddenly, the oddities I had ignored became glaring red flags. There were no photos of my mother pregnant, no pictures of me as a newborn. The first photo in our family album showed a toddler, maybe 2 years old, looking terrified in a stiff dress. And the coldness the way Linda would hug me only when others were watching, the way Greg looked at me not with love, but with the calculating gaze of an investor checking a stock portfolio. They hadn't been protecting a sickly child. They had been guarding a stolen asset. "We need to find out who you are," Mark said, his voice hard as stone, "and who they are." We left the hospital and drove straight to the Central Library downtown. Mark had an intuition that the internet might have been scrubbed or fragmented, so he wanted to look at the original source, the microfiche archives of the local newspapers from 3 decades ago. We spent 4 hours scrolling through grainy scans of old newsprint. My eyes burned, but I could not stop. I had to know. Then, Mark stopped the reel. "Rowan," he said, his hand gripping my shoulder. "Look at this." The headline from 30 years ago screamed in bold, black letters, "Heir to Thorne Dynasty, missing after fatal crash." I leaned in, reading the article through a blur of tears. It detailed a horrific accident on a rainy coastal highway. Jonathan and Elena Thorne, Silas's only son and daughter-in-law, had been killed instantly when their car went over a cliff. Their 2-year-old daughter, Rowan Thorne, was presumed to have been washed out to sea, though her body was never recovered, but it was the last paragraph that made my blood freeze in my veins. The family's driver, Gregory Hayes, and the traveling nanny, Linda Miller, survived the crash with minor injuries. Police commended them for their attempt to save the child, though they claimed the current was too strong. They didn't try to save me, I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. They took me, in the chaos. They just took me. Why, Mark asked, shaking his head in disbelief. Why kidnap a child just to raise her in poverty and treat her like a prisoner? Because of the trust, I said, the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place with a sickening snap. Silas told me to check the trust. I remember reading the bylaws years ago when I started auditing. The Thorne family trust is locked. The principal capital cannot be touched unless there is a direct blood heir to sign off on the disbursements. If the heir dies, the money goes to charity. I stood up, pushing the chair back so hard it screeched against the floor. They needed me alive, I said, my voice trembling with a rage so cold it felt like ice in my chest. They didn't want a daughter. They wanted a biological key to unlock the vault. They waited 30 years for Silas to get sick so they could use his death to trigger the inheritance, with me as their puppet to sign the checks. I looked at the photo of the grieving Silas in the old newspaper. He had lost everyone that day, or so he thought. He had spent 30 years mourning a granddaughter who was living 10 miles away, being gaslit into believing she was an invalid by the very people who stole her. Mark looked at me, his face pale. Rowan, what do we do? We have to go to the police. No, I said, wiping the tears from my face. The sadness was gone, incinerated by the white-hot heat of my anger. Not yet. If we go to the police now, they get arrested, they go to jail, and it's over. That is too easy. They stole my life, Mark. They stole my grandfather's life. I want them to lose everything. I want them to believe they have won, and then I want to watch their faces when I destroy them. I walked out of the library into the cool evening air. The Rowan Hayes who was afraid of her own shadow was dead, left behind in that archive room. The woman who walked out was Rowan Thorne, and I was done being a victim. I was ready to be the executioner of their greed. The hardest performance of my life was not standing up to my parents, but pretending to bow down to them. I knew that if I confronted Greg and Linda now, they would destroy the evidence and disappear with the money they had already stolen. To catch a predator, I had to become the wounded prey one last time. I drove to their house the next evening, forcing my posture to slump and my eyes to look downcast. When I walked into the living room, Greg was pacing, likely strategizing his next move to block the surgery. I took a deep breath and let a single tear roll down my cheek. "You were right," I whispered, my voice trembling with a feigned frailty. "I cannot do it, Doctor," Evans said my heart. He said I might not wake up. "I am so scared. Mom, I do not want to die." The tension in the room snapped instantly. Greg stopped pacing, his shoulders dropping in relief. Linda rushed over and enveloped me in a hug that smelled of expensive perfume and deceit. "Oh, honey," Linda cooed, stroking my hair. "You made the right choice. We told you that you were not strong enough. We only want to keep you safe. I am sorry about Grandpa." I sniffled, burying my face in her shoulder to hide the disgust in my eyes. "It is for the best," Greg said, pouring himself a drink. "He is suffering. Letting go is the kindest thing we can do." With their guard down, they became careless. Over the next week, I played the part of the dutiful, frightened daughter perfectly. I visited for dinner, complaining about my fatigue and anxiety. During one of these visits, I left my phone recording under the sofa cushions while I went to help Linda in the kitchen. Later that night, Mark and I listened to the audio file. The things they said made my blood boil. 3 weeks. Greg's voice crackled on the recording. The doctor said without the kidney, he has 3 weeks tops. As soon as he is in the ground, we list the estate. I already have a developer interested in the land for $12 million. And Rowan Linda's voice chimed in, followed by the clink of a wine glass. She is so gullible. Did you see her face today? She actually thanked me for saving her life. It is pathetic. She is a useful idiot. Greg laughed. As long as she signs the trust release, I do not care what she thinks. While they were busy celebrating their premature victory, I went to work on the digital front during a Sunday brunch where Greg had too many mimosas and fell asleep in front of the television. I slipped into his home office. I inserted a flash drive into his desktop. His password was insultingly simple money first. I copied everything. Buried deep in a folder labeled Old Tax Docs, I found the smoking gun. There were scanned copies of a forged adoption certificate and a falsified birth certificate dated 30 years ago. They had erased Rowan Thorne and created Rowan Hayes with a few strokes of a pen and a bribed notary. Mark took this evidence directly to a contact at the FBI. They began building a case for kidnapping, fraud, and embezzlement, but they needed time to freeze the offshore accounts. I had to keep Silas alive long enough for that to happen. I began visiting the hospital every day, bringing homemade soup for my grandfather. The nurses, charmed by my devotion, allowed me to feed him. I used these moments to swap the pills Greg's private doctor had prescribed, which I suspected were just placebos or mild sedatives with the actual medication Dr. Eris had provided to boost his strength. Slowly, the fog in Silas's eyes began to lift. He was weak, but he was there. "Rowan," he whispered one afternoon, his grip on my hand firmer than before. I remember the crash." "I know," I said softly. "We are going to fix it, but I need you to sign something." I slid the power of attorney documents Mark had drafted under the bedsheet. Silas signed them with a shaky hand, officially removing Greg as his guardian and appointing Mark instead. The danger was constant. One afternoon, I was at my parents' house, and I had my portable recorder running inside my open handbag on the coffee table. Linda walked by and stopped. "Is that your phone vibrating?" she asked, reaching for my bag. My heart hammered against my ribs. If she saw the recorder app running, the game was over. They would flee, or worse, they would hurt Silas. "Do not touch it," I snapped, a little too loudly. Linda recoiled, looking offended. "Excuse me." I quickly pivoted, channeling the whiny persona they expected. "I am sorry," I said, clutching my chest as if having palpitations. "It is my boss. He has been emailing me all day about the audit. I cannot deal with him right now. Please, Mom, I have a headache." Linda's suspicion vanished, replaced by her usual condescending pity. "You are so high-strung, Rowan." She sighed, walking away from the bag. "Maybe you should take one of my nerve pills. Maybe later," I said, exhaling a breath I had been holding for a full minute. I had the evidence. I had the power of attorney, and most importantly, I had their arrogance working against them. They thought they were waiting for an old man to die. In reality, they were waiting for the axe to fall, with the new medication coursing through his system. My grandfather was no longer the vegetable my parents needed him to be. During a brief window, when the nurse stepped out for a coffee break, Silas pulled me close, his eyes clear and sharp for the first time in years. "The wall safe," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves scraping together. "In the library, behind the portrait of your grandmother. The combination is 18, 04, 92. It is the day your parents died." He squeezed my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "The original will is there," he continued, "and the employment records. proof that Greg was just a driver, a thief. But our time was running out. My interception of the medical logs revealed a terrifying spike in the scheduled dosage of his sedatives for tonight. Greg had noticed the color returning to Silas's cheeks and had decided to accelerate his timeline. Tonight was my grandfather's 80th birthday, and Greg intended it to be his last. I had to act immediately. I called Linda, feigning a burst of manic, dutiful energy. I told her we had to throw a small, intimate celebration at the manor to keep up appearances for the neighbors. Linda, always obsessed with public perception, agreed. The atmosphere in the manor that evening was suffocating. Rain hammered against the windows, masking the sound of my footsteps as I slipped away from the dining room. Mark stayed behind, loudly engaging Linda in a debate about property taxes to keep her occupied. I could hear his voice echoing off the cavernous walls, buying me precious seconds. I entered the library, the room smelling of old paper and dust. My hands trembled as I swung the heavy portrait aside. I spun the dial. 180492. The lock clicked with a heavy thud. Inside, I found a stack of yellowed documents and a leather-bound journal. I flipped open the journal. It belonged to my mother, Elena. The entry from a month before the accident sent a chill down my spine. Linda is becoming a problem. My mother had written. She stares at my jewelry, at my clothes. I caught her trying on my wedding ring while she was cleaning the master bath. When I confronted her, she looked at me with such hatred. I need to speak to Silas about letting her and Greg go. They hadn't just stolen me. They had hated my mother for having the life they wanted. I shoved the journal and the will into the waistband of my skirt, concealing them under my loose sweater. I turned to leave, but the door handle turned before I could reach it. Greg stood in the doorway. The hallway light cast his shadow long across the Persian rug. He was holding 2 glasses of scotch, but his eyes were fixed on the slightly askew portrait on the wall behind me. "What are you doing in here?" "Rowan?" he asked. His voice was dangerously calm, a low rumble that vibrated in the quiet room. "I was just looking for a photo album," I stammered, backing away until my legs hit the heavy oak desk. "For the party. To show Grandpa." Greg stepped into the room and kicked the door shut behind him. He set the glasses down on a side table with a deliberate clink. "You have been acting strange lately," he said, taking a step toward me, asking too many questions, visiting the hospital too much, and now, snooping in my private office. He lunged forward, grabbing my upper arm. His fingers dug into my flesh, bruising the skin. "What did you take?" he snarled, shaking me. "Empty your pockets." Panic flared in my chest. If he found the documents, everything was over. He would destroy the proof, and likely kill me and Silas to cover his tracks. I had to use their own weapon against them. I had to be the weakling they created. I let my eyes roll back slightly and gasped, clutching my chest with my free hand. "Dad, my chest." I wheezed, letting my knees buckle. It hurts. I can't breathe. I collapsed onto the floor, dragging him down slightly with my dead weight. It was the performance of a lifetime, mimicking the symptoms of the fictitious heart condition they had brainwashed me into believing I had since childhood. Greg froze. The anger in his eyes was instantly replaced by annoyance and fear, not for me, but of the inconvenience of a dead body in his library during a party. He released my arm, stepping back as if I were contagious. "Useless," he muttered, looking down at me with pure contempt. "Get up. Rowan, do not make a scene." "Mark," I choked out, making my body convulse slightly. "I need my pills." He groaned and threw the door open. "Linda, get the girl's husband. She is having another one of her episodes," while he shouted into the hallway. I pressed my arm against my side, ensuring the documents were secure. Mark rushed in seconds later, playing his part perfectly. He scooped me up, looking at Greg with feigned panic. I need to get her to the emergency room, Mark shouted. Her pulse is thready. We didn't wait for an answer. Mark carried me out of the manor, past a confused Linda, and into the rainy night. As soon as the car doors locked and we were down the driveway, I sat up, pulling the journal and the will from my shirt. Drive, I said, my voice steady and cold. We have everything. Send the digital copies to the FBI agent now. Greg Hayes is done. We executed the extraction at 4 a.m. While Greg and Linda slept in their stolen comfort, a team of private security contractors I had hired using Mark's credit cards quietly moved Silas from his room at St. Jude's. We transported him to a specialized surgical center 3 counties away, a fortress of glass and steel where my parents had no influence and no names on the visitor list. By the time Greg arrived at the old hospital with his poisonous smile and a bouquet of flowers for the nurses, the bed was empty, the sheets were stripped, and the room was cold. My phone rang just as the anesthesiologist was prepping me for the transplant. I motioned for the nurse to wait and answered on the second ring. "Where is he?" Greg screamed, his voice cracking with a panic that was music to my ears. "We are at the hospital. The room is empty." "If you kidnapped him, Rowan, I swear to God I will call the police and have you thrown in a psych ward so fast your head will spin." I lay back on the gurney, staring at the sterile white ceiling tiles. I felt a strange, icy calm. "Grandpa and I are taking a little trip," I said, my voice steady. He needed some fresh air. "Do not worry about the police. Greg, we will be back in time for the emergency shareholder meeting tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock sharp." "Meeting." "What?" "Meeting," Linda screeched in the background. "You bring him back right now. He needs his medication. He is getting everything he needs," I replied. "See you tomorrow." I hung up and handed the phone to Mark. "Let's do this," I told the surgeon. The surgery took 6 hours. When I woke up, the pain in my side was a sharp, biting fire that radiated through my entire abdomen. It felt as though someone had carved a piece of me out, which, of course, they had. But as I turned my head, I saw the monitors next to me beeping in a steady rhythm. Silas was in the next room, his body accepting my kidney, his blood finally being filtered clean of the heavy metals Greg had been feeding him. Mark was sitting by my bed, looking exhausted but triumphant. "He is stable," Mark whispered, squeezing my hand. "The doctors say the color is already coming back to his face." I tried to sit up and gasped as the stitches pulled tight against my skin. "Careful," Mark said, jumping up. "You need to rest. You just gave away an organ." "Rowan. I can rest when they are in handcuffs." I gritted out through clenched teeth. "Get me the wheelchair and my suit." Mark looked at me like I was insane. "Rowan, the meeting is in 2 hours. You cannot go. You can barely stand." "I do not need to stand," I said, forcing myself to breathe through the pain. "I just need to sit at the head of the table. Help me up." The process of getting dressed was agony. Every movement sent shockwaves through my torso, but I used the pain. I focused on it, turning it into fuel. I put on a tailored navy suit that hid the bandages and the drainage tube taped to my side. I applied makeup to hide the pallor of surgery, painting on a mask of vitality and strength. We arrived at the Thorn Industries headquarters at 10 minutes to 9. I insisted on bypassing the main lobby. Mark wheeled me up the freight elevator to the executive floor. When the doors opened, I stood up. My legs shook, and sweat pricked at my hairline, but I locked my knees and refused to crumble. "Are you ready?" Mark asked, adjusting his tie. "Never been more ready," I said. We walked down the long corridor toward the boardroom. Through the glass walls, I could see them. Greg and Linda were sitting at the head of the long mahogany table, looking for all the world like the royalty they pretended to be. To their right sat their personal attorney, a man known for burying ethical violations under mountains of paperwork. They were laughing, likely joking about how I had finally snapped and run off with the old man, giving them the perfect excuse to declare Silas incompetent and me unstable. They thought they had won. They thought I was the same fragile, scared girl who apologized for existing. I pushed open the heavy double doors. The conversation inside died instantly. Greg's laugh cut off in his throat as he turned to look at me. I walked in, my steps slow and deliberate, ignoring the fire in my side. I did not look like a kidnapping victim. I looked like the CEO. "Sorry I am late," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room. "I had to drop some excess weight this morning." Greg stood up, his face twisting in confusion. "Rowan, where is Silas? You are in big trouble, young lady." I smiled, and it was the coldest thing I had ever done. "Sit down, Greg," I said, continuing to walk toward him. "You are in my chair." "Ladies and gentlemen, please!" Greg shouted, slamming his hand on the mahogany table to regain control of the room. "We are wasting time. Silas Thorne is no longer the man who built this company. He has lost his mental faculties entirely. My unstable daughter has kidnapped him in a fit of delusion. I am asking for an emergency vote to transfer full executive power to me immediately. It is the only way to save Thorne Industries from ruin." He looked authoritative, the picture of a concerned leader. The board members exchanged worried glances, their pens hovering over the voting ballots. "I object," I said, stepping fully into the room. "Security!" Greg yelled, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Get her out of here. She is dangerous." "I am not going anywhere," I replied calmly, "and neither are you." I nodded to Mark, who was standing by the room's AV control panel. He pressed a button, and the projection screen behind Greg flickered. The graph showing quarterly revenue projections vanished. In its place, a massive, high-definition image of a medical report appeared. It was the DNA analysis Dr. Eris had run just 48 hours ago. "What is this?" a board member asked, adjusting his glasses. "This," I said, limping slightly as I walked toward the head of the table, "is the reason Greg Hayes wants to run this company, and it is the reason he tried to kill the founder." "Shut up!" Greg screamed, his face draining of color. "Turn it off, Mark. Turn it off." "The document on the screen is a genetic compatibility test," I continued, ignoring him. "It shows a 99.9% probability of direct lineage between Silas Thorne and myself. But if you look at the second page..." Mark swiped the screen. The new chart showed 2 flat lines, 0 matches. "I am not Rowan Hayes," I declared, my voice steady despite the pain in my side. "My name is Rowan Thorne. I am the daughter of Jonathan and Elena Thorne. I survived the crash 30 years ago. These 2 people are not my parents. They are the employees who stole me from the wreckage to secure a payout." A collective gasp went through the room. The board members looked from the screen to Greg, whose mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water. "She is lying!" Linda shrieked, jumping up from her chair. She looked wild, her carefully coiffed hair coming loose. "She is mentally ill. We raised her. We loved her, Rowan. Baby. How can you do this to your mother?" "You are not my mother," I said coldly. "And you did not love me. You loved the leverage I provided." I signaled Mark again. The screen changed to a toxicology report. "For the past 5 years," I explained to the horrified audience. "Silas Thorne has been ingesting small doses of arsenic and mercury. It was administered daily in the medication provided by his guardians. It was designed to mimic kidney failure and dementia. They were not caring for him. They were slowly assassinating him." "That is slander," Linda wailed, tears streaming down her face as she reached out toward the board members. "We sacrificed everything for that girl. We have been victims of her ingratitude. I washed her clothes. I cooked her meals." "Stop acting, Linda," I said. "The performance is over." I pulled my phone from my pocket and pressed play on the audio file, holding it up to the room's microphone. Greg's voice boomed through the surround sound speakers. "Crystal clear. She is a useful idiot. As long as she signs the trust release, I do not care what she thinks." Then Linda's voice followed, accompanied by the sound of laughter. "She is so gullible. Stupid cash cow." The silence that followed was absolute. Linda collapsed back into her chair, her face buried in her hands. Greg looked around the room and saw the hostility in the eyes of the men and women he had tried to charm just minutes ago. He realized the game was up. Panic took over. Greg bolted toward the double doors, shoving a junior executive out of the way. He grabbed the handles and pulled, but they did not budge. "Sit down, Greg," Mark said from the corner of the room, holding up a key card. "I took the liberty of locking the electronic access when we entered. The police are on their way up the elevator as we speak." Mark walked over to the table and placed a stack of documents in front of the chairman of the board. "As Mr. Silas Thorne's newly appointed legal counsel," Mark announced, "I am hereby serving Greg and Linda Hayes with a revocation of all guardianship powers. Furthermore, we are freezing all assets associated with the Thorne estate pending a federal investigation into fraud and attempted murder." Greg slumped against the door, sliding down until he hit the floor. He looked small, pathetic, stripped of the arrogance that had been his armor for 3 decades. I walked over to where they were huddled, the man and woman who had haunted my nightmares and controlled my every breath. I felt the incision on my side throb, a reminder of the piece of myself I had given to save the man they tried to destroy. "You told me I was weak," I said, looking straight into Greg's terrified eyes. "You told me the world was dangerous and that I needed you to survive. But that was the biggest lie of all." I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of 30 years of stolen time. "You forbade me from saving him not because you cared about my health," I said. "You forbade me because you were terrified. You knew that if I saved him, I would look into his eyes and see the truth. You were scared I would realize that this blood does not belong to you." The heavy double doors of the boardroom did not just open, they burst inward with the force of a battering ram. Before Greg could even scramble to his feet, a dozen armed officers wearing FBI windbreakers swarmed the room, their weapons drawn and leveled at the 2 people who had stolen my life. Federal agents, a lead officer bellowed, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "Greg Hayes, Linda Hayes, you are under arrest for kidnapping, wire fraud, and the attempted murder of Silas Thorne. Hands where we can see them." The boardroom erupted into chaos. Chairs toppled over as the other board members scrambled away from the accused, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. Greg, the man who had always prided himself on his control and composure, disintegrated before my eyes. He did not go quietly. He lunged toward Linda, his face twisted into a mask of pure, desperate malice. "It was her," Greg screamed, pointing a shaking finger at his wife while officers wrestled his arms behind his back. "I just drove the car. It was Linda's idea to take the baby. She said we could use the trust fund. I just did what she told me. Do not put this on me." Linda looked at her husband, the man she had conspired with for 30 years, with a look of utter betrayal. Then she broke. The polished facade of the caring mother cracked and fell away, leaving behind a sobbing, pathetic mess. The car was burning. Linda wailed, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. Jonathan and Elena were dead. We saw the baby crawling in the mud. We just picked her up. We saved her. We deserve that money. We raised her when no one else would. "You raised a hostage," I said, stepping forward so she could hear me over the commotion. "And you tortured an old man to keep your paycheck coming." As the agents dragged them out of the boardroom, I followed. We took the elevator down to the lobby, but I did not let them exit through the back. I had arranged for a little farewell party. As the glass doors of the main entrance slid open, the blinding flash of 50 camera bulbs lit up the overcast morning. I had tipped off every major news outlet in Seattle that the mystery of the missing Thorne heiress was about to be solved. Greg recoiled from the light like a vampire, trying to hide his face, but there was nowhere to hide. The reporters shouted questions, their voices merging into a roar of condemnation. "Mr. Hayes! Did you poison Silas Thorne, Mrs. Hayes? Is it true you kidnapped the heir?" I stood on the steps, watching the spectacle as they were being shoved into the back of the squad cars. I walked up to the open window of the vehicle holding Greg. He looked up at me, his eyes red and rimmed with fear. "Rowan," he stammered, his voice trembling. "Please, the lawyers. We need money for the lawyers. You cannot let us rot in a public defender's office. We are still your parents." I leaned in, resting my hands on the doorframe. "You have no money." "Greg," I said softly, "while you were busy trying to steal the company this morning, my team was busy executing a seizure order. I have frozen every single account. The offshore funds in the Cayman Islands gone. The house liens have been placed on it. You are penniless." His jaw dropped, but I was not finished. "And do not worry about getting out on bail," I added. "I sent your cooked accounting books to the Internal Revenue Service about an hour ago. You evaded taxes on millions of dollars of stolen money. Even if you beat the murder charge, the tax fraud ensures you will die in a concrete cell." A detective approached me as the cars started their engines. He held a plastic evidence bag containing a small vial of clear liquid. "Ms. Thorne," the detective said grimly, "we executed a search warrant at the Hayes residence this morning. We found this in Greg's home office. It is a concentrated digitalis solution. And we found a schedule." "A schedule?" I asked, feeling a cold shiver despite the adrenaline. "Yes," he replied. According to his notes, this was for you. The plan was to induce a cardiac arrest 2 weeks after your grandfather passed. They were going to make it look like your weak heart finally gave out, leaving them as the sole beneficiaries of the estate. I looked back at the patrol car as it pulled away, watching Greg's face disappear behind the tinted glass. They had not just planned to steal from me, they had already dug my grave. As the sirens faded into the distance and the rain began to fall again, washing the streets clean, I expected to feel sad. I expected to mourn the parents I thought I had. But as I stood there, taking a deep breath of the wet, cold air, I felt nothing but lightness. The heavy blanket of guilt, obligation, and fear that they had draped over me for 3 decades was gone. They were not my family. They were just a bad dream. And I had finally woken up. 6 months had passed since the storm that tore my life apart, and the silence that once suffocated Thorne Manor had been replaced by the vibrant sounds of life. I sat on the stone terrace overlooking the garden, which was no longer a tangle of dead weeds and thorns. It was a riot of color now, with blooming hydrangeas and carefully manicured rose bushes that I had planted myself. Next to me sat Silas, looking nothing like the dying man I had found in the dark that fateful night. His skin was flushed with health. His eyes were sharp, and he was currently tapping a tablet with vigorous energy. The kidney I had given him was working perfectly, filtering not just his blood, but the years of poison out of his system. "You see this projection?" Rowan Silas asked, pointing to the screen with a steady hand. "If we pivot the logistics division to renewable energy transport, we could increase our quarterly yield by 15%. You have the instinct for this, granddaughter. It is in your blood. I had a good teacher." I smiled, pouring him a cup of herbal tea. "And I am not talking about business school. The peace we felt now had been hard won. The trial of Greg and Linda Hayes had concluded just 2 weeks ago. It was a national sensation, broadcasted on every major network. The jury took less than 3 hours to return a guilty verdict on all counts: kidnapping, aggravated fraud, embezzlement, attempted murder, and elder abuse. The judge, a stern woman who seemed particularly disgusted by their betrayal of a child, showed no mercy. She sentenced them to life in prison without the possibility of parole. I remembered watching them as the bailiffs led them away. They looked small, gray, and utterly defeated. They had spent their lives building a cage for me, only to end up locking themselves inside one forever. With the legal battle over, I had taken the final step to reclaim my identity. I stood before a clerk at the city records office and legally expunged the name Hayes from my existence. My driver's license now read Rowan Thorne. Seeing that name printed in black and white felt like taking my first breath of real air. Mark and I had moved into the manor shortly after the surgery. We opened the heavy curtains that had been drawn for 20 years, letting the sunlight flood the dusty hallways. We replaced the smell of antiseptic with the aroma of fresh coffee and home-cooked meals. The house was no longer a mausoleum for the dead. It was a home for the living. "What are you thinking about?" Mark asked, walking onto the terrace and wrapping his arms around my shoulders. "I am thinking about the future," I said, leaning back into him, "and the foundation." I had used a significant portion of the assets recovered from Greg's offshore accounts to establish the Jonathan and Elena Thorne Foundation. It was dedicated to providing legal and financial aid to victims of human trafficking and guardianship fraud. I wanted to ensure that no other child would ever have to wonder who they really were, and no other elderly person would be silenced by greed. I subconsciously touched the scar on my side beneath my silk blouse. For a long time, I thought it would be a painful reminder of the trauma, but now, tracing the raised skin, I realized it was not a wound. It was a medal. It was the physical proof of my courage and the unbreakable bond between my grandfather and me. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. Silas closed his tablet and looked out at the view, a peaceful smile on his face. I reached out and took his hand, feeling the warmth of his skin, a warmth that Greg and Linda had tried so hard to extinguish. It was ironic, really. If they had just treated me with kindness, if they had just let me visit him, they might have gotten away with it all. But their greed made them careless. "They forbade me from saving you," I whispered to the wind. They thought their rules would keep me under control. They did not realize that by trying to bury the truth, they were actually planting a seed. And now, that seed had grown into a forest they could never cut down. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from. I would love to connect with you and hear your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and smash that hype button so this story can reach even more people. See you in the next video.